It's interesting because actually patient information clinical trials has got a relatively recent history. It wasn't really until the 1970s with a lady called Rose Kushner, who wrote about this in her books and advocated patient information in the USA. And she was a major freelance writer and breast cancer survivor. And we've seen over the last 3 decades, of course, increasing patient involvement within clinical trials. But at the same time, of course, the breadth, the complexity, and just the sheer number of clinical trials has exponentially increased. And to a certain extent, that's actually collided with very large changes in demography. So the aging population, ethnicity mixes in different countries. And to add a further level of complication, and of course, is the technology involved in communication has changed beyond recognition over the last 3 decades. I mean, I certainly remember having analog phones weighing 20 kilograms, where you were able to make a phone call if you were not right next to an antenna to where David is sitting. Nowadays, we see Jan sitting here with his wonderful new iPad with social media platforms. Imagine what it's going to be like in 20 or 30 years' time. So taken together, there is a perception, and this may not be correct though, that there's been a divergence between technology, what patients are seeking in terms of information, and also just the sheer complexity of cancer clinical trials ongoing out there in the community. Now, it's almost to be argued as well, we're not talking about information, we're now talking increasingly about intelligence. Information is raw and undigested, and what we really should be talking about is patient intelligence involvement in clinical trials. Now, as part of the Eurocancercoms project, we did do a small survey of patient organizations, over 760 in North America and Europe, and it was interesting high-level findings. Let me put these out for discussion. In Europe, only about 29% of organizations provide clinical trials information to their communities, and this compares to 78% in North America. Now, the quality ratings come out as pretty much equal, slightly lower in Europe though. The other big difference though is that clinical trials information is almost the lowest level of information that patients are seeking from the organizations. There are 7 and 8 other types of information people go to for organizations. So clinical trials information comes right at the bottom. And then finally, actually, the way people are gathering their information is very different. In Europe, very strong preference for face-to-face meetings and organizational meetings like this. Whereas in the USA, a very strong trophism for website. So the questions that arise from all this, and just from that general background, is first of all, why is the appetite for clinical trials information from the perception studies so low, in inverted commas? Is it because it's too complex? Is there not enough clinical trial activity? And more importantly, how should we be packaging information to turn it into proper intelligence for patients contemplating involvement in clinical trials over the next decade? Are social media platforms the right way to go? Should we be focusing exclusively on an e-solution? Or do we still need to remember that human beings are primates and we do like to sit around and groom each other in a more personal way?
I think it actually is worth sometimes comparing Europe to the US, where things are done differently over there to here. Some good things, some things aren't so good. But we were just talking earlier today in a meeting, comparing, for example, the clinicaltrials.gov website with the EudraCT website, and lamenting the fact that the EudraCT website didn't contain information about actually locations of clinical trials and who the investigators were, and if you were a patient, who you would contact if you went on that website, whereas clinicaltrials.gov has all the information there, phone numbers, email addresses, and everything else. And I think the patients really do need to have access to all of this information in the beginning. And that isn't always the case here, as we've seen. I also think you talked about packaging information, which I think is a very apt way of putting it. And I think really from the beginning, almost at diagnosis, we have to get into a kind of way of learning about clinical trials, not waiting until we're desperate, to get a treatment. We need to be told as patients and caregivers, because caregivers play an important role in deciding whether someone participates in a clinical trial, we need to be told almost in diagnosis that there are clinical trials, and we need explanations of how they work. We need explanations of the informed consent involved with that kind of thing. So it's an education, it's a package right from the very beginning.
Let's get disease specific. We're going to choose colon cancer as an example. Yola Gore-Booth, you are the founder and CEO of a newly established organization, Europa Colon. So, taking on clinical trials in colon cancer patients, how important is the issue of patient involvement and recruitment?
I was thinking as we were sitting around the table here, we're all informed, we're all passionate about our subjects, and we all know exactly what's going on. But out there is a massive population of people who continue to live under the impression that they are guinea pigs if they go into a clinical trial. And I work on the ground with a lot of colon cancer patients throughout Eastern Europe, Central Europe, Northern Europe. Some countries are much better, obviously, but many countries still have this almost taboo. And I think we need to go back to real basics. You've written this amazing book, which I was delighted that we were participants in, A Guide for Patients with Advanced Cancer. I think we should think about writing a book that speaks at the same, there may be something out there that I'm not aware of, but that speaks at normal people speak, and that points out not just the benefits of clinical trials, but it also has to point out what are the disadvantages, but not confuse the patient to such a degree that they're thinking, oh, I don't know, and if I do this, this is going to happen, and if I do this, that's going to happen. I think it's got to be done in a non-inflammatory way, in such a way that the patient will look at it, and we talk about informed patients, we talk about patient rights, and I think that they should be able to understand, and I agree entirely with Kathy, where these are, where the trials are. Because there's another thing, you put in colon cancer trials, and you get a plethora of information, and you get completely lost. So I think an organization like ours should really have a guide to where colon cancer trials are available, and I think there should be clear explanation on how they can benefit from it. And I think it's Professor de Gramont. He's when I met with him once, he was saying, patients have to understand that if they come onto the trial, they're being offered something. They should feel extremely almost honored that they're being able to go into a trial, and that they understand how much this could help them. And I was arguing with him, yes, but they've also got to be told what might go wrong. So yes, that's my view, is that there should be clear and non-complicated explanation of the benefits and the problems that may occur of clinical trials.
It would be interesting to open it up, since there are other disease groups represented here. Are there any other comments on the clinical trials issue before we move on? Yes.
We put our clinical trials on our website, and we educate our patients in seminars, and I just have the program again here. What's the meaning and the benefit to be part of a trial? Yeah, and how can I benefit as a patient when I take part? And that is always and always and always again our motto, to bring the patients into the theme, that they really understand why they need to be part of a trial as a cancer patient, because, there are risks, but the other risk is much higher, to die.
In the U.S., we've been questioned, is the word clinical trials, is that a bad choice of words? And I'm just wondering, from the European perspective, I know, Stella, you want to say something too, but I just want to throw that out, wondering, is the terminology that we use to describe the clinical trials process part of the problem?
I'm going to take a different stand. I think that there's a real problem of what has been called the therapeutic misconception in clinical studies. Clinical studies are about the the development of generalizable data to help future patients. They're not about individualized patient care. Many patients are lured into going into clinical studies or clinical trials, call them what you will, being sold that that this is for their benefit. I think that is dishonest. I think that there will be some patients who will benefit, and there will be some patients who will be harmed. There are, and even the very term patient in the clinical study. When one goes into a study, one becomes a subject, okay, because it is no longer a therapeutic relationship, but it is a relationship between an investigator and a study participant. And this is part of the corollary of that is that the physician who oversees the care of the patient in the study loses flexibility about creating a nuanced approach for the individual patient. Now, I don't belittle at all, and I emphasise the importance of development of new generalisable data to push the frontiers of cancer care. However, I think that the approach in explaining the clinical trial process, it's important not to encourage the therapeutic misconception.
And so Nathan and I are pals. That was a bit polarised, and it's good to be debate, and I think we could spend an afternoon going around in circles with it. I quite like bold, dogmatic statements, because if we can say things that are simple and clear with a single voice, they carry further in the corridors of power. And what Richard said, I find fascinating, the fact that information in clinical trials was 7th or 8th or 9th or 10th. And for me, one of the hallmarks, we're going to disagree a little, one of the hallmarks of a quality cancer centre is one that's involved in trials. And one of the things I recommended to patients in the UK, if you're going to a cancer centre, I would say, are you involved in trials? Are there trials going on? Because without that, I'm not sure that you're going to get the quality of cancer treatment that one would mandate. That's a really strong statement. And if we said something really bold and simple like that, all these other really important, but in a way secondary questions about how we communicate, how we present data would be quite different. Now, is that too controversial for us to come out and say, if you go to a cancer centre that isn't doing any trials or studies whatsoever, then we would be a little anxious that the quality of care that you're getting may not be of the first rank. That's a big, bold statement. There's some evidence to back it up. But if we could say something like that, suddenly information in clinical trials doesn't become 7th or 8th, it's 2nd or 3rd. And we promote a whole generational change in how we get our colleagues, our friends, our patients involved in the whole clinical trial agenda.
We don't disagree. We don't disagree at all, and in fact, I think that there was a wonderful paper written a couple of years ago. Zeke Emanuel was one of the co-authors about the ethical obligation to participate in clinical studies, and that ethical because everyone benefits ultimately from the knowledge which is generated, and people who choose not to participate are essentially free riders. And that is true for clinicians, and that's true for patients. And so, we don't disagree. We don't disagree whatsoever, actually.
One major issue is that when a patient is diagnosed with cancer, they have so much information thrown at them that it is impossible to also address this issue and understand the pros and cons and what it actually means. And as we have opened up the taboo or the subject of cancer so that people actually talk about it in the general public without being a cancer patient, but they know about it and they know about prevention and they know what types of cancer we need to look at. I think that this aspect of why people, individuals, patients should look at being part of these wider studies in order to help to push the frontiers ahead should be talked about to the wider public, and not only to the patient that finds themselves faced with a disease, a diagnosis, and has to understand so much else and make so many decisions. It's too much. But if this is opened up into the level of society so that we know why these are going on, what they mean, what the pros and cons are, when you're faced with this kind of reality, then maybe you have a better understanding.
I would just, very simple, short statement, support completely what Stella said, because I think the idea of talking about clinical trials with patients is actually too limited. You're talking to people who are under a lot of pressure. It needs to be made more available to the general public so that everybody understands. There will be a better appreciation and more people will participate. If you're targeting just the patient or the patient's immediate family, there are so many other pressures on them that it's difficult to interpret that.
I know certainly in the brain tumor world that patients join clinical trials primarily, I would say, not because they want to benefit society in general, but because they want to survive longer. We have so few therapies. There may be one or two that are available as standard care. Beyond that, it's all experimental. And patients are clamoring to go on trials, anything, basically, even if it means survival of 2 months, 3 months, whatever. That 3 months in a prognosis of 18 months is a major amount of time when you consider what life could be or what death could be. So I'm not sure that we need to necessarily totally focus on patients going into clinical trials to leave a legacy for other patients. They are going because they want to survive, certainly in rare cancers.
If we could talk about clinical trials as part of, the menu of choices early on, instead of waiting to throw out the subject of a clinical trial when you're facing more advanced disease.